The darkness of space stretched endlessly in all directions as the alien mining vessel Cathera drifted without power through the void. Inside the damaged ship, Commander Velrin pressed his four-fingered hands against the cold metal of the communications console and sent out another distress call into the emptiness. His throat sacs inflated with anxiety as he watched the message disappear into the vast nothing, with no response coming back. This was the 47th call he had sent over the past 3 rotation cycles, and still, nobody had answered. The mining accident had not been their fault, but the Zorathi government did not care about fault when it came to expensive rescue operations in disputed territory. Velrin looked around the dim emergency-lit bridge at his remaining crew of 17 souls, who sat quietly against the walls, trying to conserve oxygen. Their blue-tinged skin had started to turn pale gray from the thin atmosphere and lack of proper nutrients. The ship's life support system was failing one section at a time, and the engineering team had already sealed off 4 compartments to preserve what little breathable air remained. 3 weeks ago, the Cathera had been a fully functioning mining vessel, with a crew of 23 extracting rare minerals from an asteroid field in the outer territories. Then the pirates had come with their weapons hot and their demands simple. The Cathera had run because fighting was suicide, and mining ships carried no weapons according to Galactic Council regulations. They had fled across the border into forbidden space where territorial treaties prevented most ships from following. The pirates had eventually given up the chase, but the damage to the Cathera's engines had already been done. Now they sat in the dead zone between 3 different territorial claims where nobody wanted to risk diplomatic incidents by crossing unmarked boundaries to save a crew of lowly miners. Velrin had sent messages to his own government first, but received only a terse reply stating that rescue operations in disputed space would violate treaty agreements. He had contacted the Vraxian delegation next, since they controlled the nearest sector, but they too had declined, citing the same protocols. Even the merchant guilds, who usually cared more about profit than politics, had refused to come, saying the risk was too high for the potential reward. The young navigator, Theris, approached Velrin with her datapad showing the latest system diagnostics. Her voice was barely a whisper to save energy. The oxygen levels had dropped to 32% of normal and would reach critical failure in less than 2 rotation cycles. The water recycling system had stopped working completely yesterday, and they were rationing the last reserves. The temperature continued to drop as the heating system pulled from batteries that would not last another day. Velrin nodded slowly and dismissed her with a gentle touch of his hand to her shoulder in the traditional Zorathi gesture of solidarity. There was nothing more to say that had not already been said. They would die here in the cold and dark, and their bodies would drift through space until the ship eventually fell into a star or got pulled apart by a black hole millions of years from now. Such was the fate of those who found themselves on the wrong side of diplomatic boundaries. Returned to the communications console one more time and prepared to send another message, even though he knew it was pointless. His fingers moved across the controls, typing out the standard distress format, with their location and status and remaining life support capacity. Just as he was about to transmit the message, a burst of static erupted from the speakers, making several crew members jump in surprise. Voice crackled through the interference, speaking in broken and heavily accented Galactic Common that sounded like it was being filtered through grinding metal. The words were hard to understand at first because the pronunciation was all wrong, but Velrin managed to piece together the meaning. Someone was responding to their distress call and asking for their exact coordinates and the nature of their emergency. The voice identified itself as coming from a vessel called the Frontier Spirit. Velrin felt his primary heart skip several beats as he quickly responded with their information and a desperate plea for assistance. The voice on the other end acknowledged and then said something that made Velrin's blood run cold in his veins. The speaker identified themselves as Captain Jake Morrison and stated they were human and they were coming to help humans. The word spread through the bridge crew like electricity, causing a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Everyone in the known galaxy had heard of humans by now. They were the newest species to achieve faster-than-light travel and make contact with the Galactic Council. They came from a world that other species classified as a death world, where the gravity was crushing and the atmosphere was poison to most races, and the weather could kill in hundreds of different ways. The humans themselves were considered strange and dangerous with their odd social behaviors, and their tendency to pack bond with anything, including species, that wanted to eat them. The Galactic Council had tried to integrate humanity into the standard protocols, but the humans kept ignoring rules they did not agree with. They laughed at safety regulations and took risks that made career diplomats faint. They argued with the Council over what they called basic rights, and they refused to follow territorial boundaries when they thought those boundaries were unjust. Some species admired them and others feared them, but everyone agreed that humans were completely unpredictable. Velrin stared at the communications console, trying to process what was happening. A human ship was coming to rescue them, which meant they might actually survive, but it also meant dealing with Deathworlders who operated on logic that made no sense to civilized species. He looked at his crew and saw the same conflict in their faces. They wanted to live, but the cost might be interaction with creatures who were fundamentally alien in ways that went beyond physical appearance. The communications console chirped again, and Captain Jake Morrison's voice came through more clearly this time. He said his ship would reach them in approximately 6 standard hours and told them to hold on and keep their crew calm. The way he spoke was casual, almost friendly, like he was discussing weather patterns instead of a life-or-death rescue operation in forbidden space. Velrin tried to respond with proper gratitude, but his translator was struggling with the human's rapid speech, patterns, and strange idioms. As the communication ended, Velrin sat back in his command chair and allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. They were not saved yet, and dealing with humans might create an entirely new set of problems, but at least someone had answered their call. In a galaxy full of species who valued protocols over lives, a group of Deathworld creatures were willing to risk everything to help strangers. It made no logical sense, but Velrin found he did not care about logic anymore. He cared about breathing and living and seeing another sunrise, even if that sunrise came from a ship full of insane humans. The Frontier Spirit arrived exactly when Captain Jake Morrison said it would, which surprised Velrin more than anything else, because punctuality was rare in space travel. Through the cracked viewport of the Cathara's bridge, Velrin watched the human vessel approach at speeds that made his navigational computer flash angry red warnings about collision risks and unsafe maneuvering. The ship moved like a predator, closing in on prey with sharp turns and sudden accelerations that should have torn the hull plating right off the frame. Velrin's communications officer, Marek, gasped and pointed at the display showing the human ship's trajectory calculations. The Frontier Spirit was going to match their tumbling rotation by executing a series of micro-burns that required split-second timing and perfect coordination. One mistake would send both ships spinning into each other, resulting in catastrophic destruction. But the humans performed the maneuver. Flawlessly and suddenly, their ship was holding position, relative to the Cathara at a distance of less than 200 meters. The view screen flickered to life, showing the face of Captain Jake Morrison for the first time. Velrin had seen images of humans before in the Galactic Council databases, but seeing one speak directly to him was an entirely different experience. The human had only 2 eyes positioned in the front of his head like a predator species, and his face was flat with strange features that moved when he spoke. His skin was a light tan color, and thin hair covered the top of his head in a dark brown shade. Jake smiled, which Velrin had learned was a positive expression for humans showing teeth that looked disturbingly sharp. Next to him stood another human female with longer hair pulled back in a practical style and darker skin. She was introduced as Lisa Garrett, the first officer, and her expression was focused and serious as she studied the Cathara's condition through her own screens. Jake spoke in his broken galactic common, explaining that he was sending over their chief engineer and medical officer to assess the damage and help stabilize the Cathara's systems. He made it sound simple and routine, like this was something his crew did every day. Velrin tried to protest that the rescue was too dangerous, and that perhaps they should just evacuate the Cathara crew to the Frontier Spirit, but Jake waved away his concerns with a casual gesture. Human Captain explained that moving 17 Zarathi through hard vacuum in their weakened condition was more dangerous than repairing the ship where it floated. He said his engineer could patch the hull breaches, and his medical officer could treat the crew for oxygen deprivation and exposure. The confidence in his voice was absolute, as if failure was not even a possibility he considered. Velrin wanted to argue, but his crew was dying and the humans were offering help, so he agreed. 20 minutes later, a docking tube extended from the Frontier Spirit and attached itself to the Cathera's emergency airlock, with a series of loud, clanging sounds that echoed through the dying ship. Velrin and several crew members gathered near the airlock, watching nervously as the pressure equalized and the inner door slowly opened. Two figures in bulky, white suits stepped through carrying equipment, cases and moving with purpose that suggested extensive training. The first human removed his helmet, revealing a broad face with red-tinted hair and pale skin covered in small brown spots that Velrin's database identified as freckles. This was Danny Webb, the chief engineer, and he was enormous by Zorathi standards, standing at least 2 heads taller than Velrin, and built with thick muscles that came from living in high gravity. His suit looked barely adequate for vacuum exposure by galactic standards, but he seemed completely comfortable. The second human was smaller and female, with dark skin and curly black hair pulled back under a cap. Christine Hayes, the medical officer, had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she offered what appeared to be a reassuring smile. She carried medical equipment that looked crude and oversized compared to standard galactic medical technology, but she handled it with the ease of long practice. Danny immediately began scanning the walls and ceiling with a handheld device while speaking rapidly into his communicator in the human language that Velrin's translator struggled to process. The words came fast and overlapping with Jake Morrison's responses from the Frontier Spirit. Lisa Garrett's voice joined the conversation, adding observations about structural integrity and atmosphere composition. The humans worked in a kind of controlled chaos that seemed inefficient, but somehow got results. Christine approached the nearest Zorathi crew member and began running her medical scanner over them while speaking in slow, careful galactic common. She asked about symptoms and how long they had been in reduced oxygen, and whether anyone had serious injuries beyond the general deterioration. Her bedside manner was gentle and professional, putting the nervous Zorathi somewhat at ease despite her alien appearance. Danny suddenly called out something urgent, and Jake's voice came back equally sharp. The engineer was pointing at a section of wall where a crack had started spreading from one of the original impact sites. He explained in simplified terms that the hull breach was worse than their external scans had shown. The internal support structure was compromised and continuing to fail. If they did not stabilize it soon, the entire section would decompress, taking half the ship with it. Lisa's voice cut through the chatter with a calm question about how long they had before catastrophic failure. Danny estimated maybe 4 hours if they were lucky. Jake asked what he needed, and Danny rattled off a list of materials and tools that would take 3 hours to get into position. The math was impossible and everyone knew it, but the humans did not seem concerned about impossibility. Christine finished her initial assessment of the crew and contacted Jake with her report. The Zorathi were suffering from oxygen deprivation and dehydration and cold exposure, but none of it was immediately fatal if treated quickly. However, her medical supplies were designed for human biology, and she would need to modify medications on the fly to work with Zorathi physiology. She made it sound like a minor inconvenience rather than a dangerous experimental procedure. Velrin finally found his voice and asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the humans arrived. He wanted to know why they were doing this and risking their own lives and potentially starting a diplomatic incident with the Galactic Council. The humans were new to the galactic community, and surely they understood the consequences of violating territorial protocols. Yet here they were charging into forbidden space to rescue a crew of alien miners they had never met. Jake's face appeared on a portable screen that Danny had set up, and the human captain looked directly at Velrin with those strange, forward-facing predator eyes. He explained that where humans came from, they had a simple rule about people in trouble. When someone called for help, you answered. It did not matter who they were, or what species, or what flag they flew, or what territory they were floating in. You helped because it was the right thing to do and because you would want someone to help you if positions were reversed. Velrin felt his throat sacs contract with emotion that his translator could not adequately express in galactic common. He told Jake that his species was insane, and that no logical civilization operated on such reckless principles. The human captain laughed, which was a barking sound that startled several of the Zorathi crew members. Jake agreed that humans probably were insane by galactic standards, but insanity had its advantages sometimes. Danny was already moving toward the damage section with his equipment, unpacking tools that looked primitive but effective. Christine was distributing modified medications to the Zorathi crew, with careful instructions about dosage and side effects. Up on the Frontier Spirit, Kevin Price, the pilot, was repositioning the ship to provide a stable anchor point while Amy Foster, the communications officer, was filing emergency diplomatic paperwork to justify their presence in restricted space. The rescue operation had begun in earnest, and Velrin realized he was witnessing something the galaxy had not seen in a very long time. He was watching a species that valued individual lives over collective protocols and immediate action over careful deliberation. The humans were terrifying in their intensity, but also inspiring in their absolute refusal to abandon people in need. Velrin did not know if his crew would survive the next few hours, but he knew they had a better chance now than they had before the Deathworlders arrived. Danny Webb moved through the damaged sections of the Cathara with a confidence that bordered on recklessness as Velrin watched from a safe distance. The human engineer had stripped down to a lighter suit that offered minimal protection because he claimed the bulky emergency suit restricted his movement too much. He crawled into spaces that were partially exposed to vacuum using only a thin helmet and what he kept calling his toolkit, which appeared to be a collection of adhesive materials and handheld welding equipment that looked centuries out of date. The crack in the hull had spread another 2 meters since Danny first identified it, and now the metal groaned with stress that made even the humans pause. Jake Morrison's voice came through the communicators asking for status updates every few minutes while Lisa Garrett monitored structural integrity readings from the Frontier Spirit. The numbers kept getting worse, but Danny just kept working with his hands moving quickly and surely as he applied layer after layer of some kind of flexible sealant. Christine Hayes had set up a temporary medical station in what used to be the crew galley and was treating the Zorathi one at a time with modified medications. She had explained to Velrin that human medicine was aggressive by galactic standards because humans were aggressive creatures who healed fast and could tolerate substances that would kill most species. She had to dilute everything and adjust dosages based on quick scans and educated guesses because there was no time for proper testing protocols. One of the younger crew members named Korath had started showing signs of serious oxygen deprivation, with his skin turning nearly white and his breathing becoming shallow and labored. Christine immediately gave him a stimulant mixed with an oxygen carrier compound that she normally used for human altitude sickness. Velrin watched nervously as she injected the medication directly into Korath's primary circulation node, hoping that her modifications were correct. Within minutes, Korath's color began to improve and his breathing steadied. Christine nodded with satisfaction and moved on to the next patient. Up on the Frontier Spirit, Kevin Price was performing miracles of his own, keeping both vessels stable, despite gravitational eddies from a nearby gas giant that kept trying to pull them into different orbits. The young pilot's hands moved constantly across his controls, making micro-adjustments that compensated for forces that would have sent most ships tumbling. Amy Foster sat at the communications station maintaining contact with both vessels, while simultaneously filing diplomatic notifications with 3 different territorial governments explaining the emergency rescue operation. The work continued, for hours with humans and Zorathi, falling into an exhausted rhythm of crisis management. Danny finally sealed the major hull breach but discovered 2 more smaller cracks that were starting to spread. He called back to Jake asking for more sealant materials and was told they were running low on supplies. The human engineer made a sound that Velrin's translator interpreted as frustration, mixed with determination, and said he would make do with what he had. Christine ran out of one critical medication and spent 20 minutes synthesizing a replacement, using components from 3 different drugs in her kit. She muttered to herself in the human language while working, and Velrin caught words that sounded like prayers or curses or possibly both. When she finished, she tested the new compound on herself first, injecting a small dose and waiting to see if she had any adverse reactions. Velrin was horrified by this violation of medical safety protocols, but Christine just shrugged and said, human doctors sometimes had to be their own test subjects. The Cathara's life support system was still failing despite the hull repairs, because the primary oxygen generator had been damaged beyond Danny's ability to fix with his limited tools. Jake made a decision that sent chills through Velrin's entire body. The Frontier Spirit would transfer some of its own oxygen reserves to the Cathara, even though that would leave the human ship with barely enough emergency reserves for its own crew. Lisa argued briefly about the risk, but Jake overruled her, saying, They could always call for help if they got into trouble, while the Zorathi had no such option. Kevin carefully maneuvered the frontier spirit into position to connect transfer hoses, while Danny worked on adapting the Cathara's intake systems to handle the different oxygen mixture that humans breathed. The human atmosphere was too rich in oxygen and too high in pressure for Zorathi biology. So Danny had to build a makeshift regulator using spare parts and materials scavenged from non-essential systems. He worked with tools in one hand and reference manuals on a datapad in the other, frequently asking Christine questions about safe oxygen levels for Zorathi physiology. The transfer began slowly, with oxygen flowing from the human ship into the dying Cathara. Velrin monitored the atmospheric readings, watching as the numbers gradually climbed from critical levels toward something approaching sustainable. The crew members who had been treated by Christine started showing more energy, and color returned to their skin. The temperature in the ship began to stabilize as well, because Danny had somehow rerouted power from the human ship to temporarily boost the Cathara's heating system. Then disaster struck in the form of a micrometeorite impact that nobody saw coming. The tiny piece of space debris, moving at incredible velocity, punched through the Cathara's already weakened hull, in a section that Danny had not yet reinforced. Alarms screamed and crew members scrambled as atmosphere began venting into space through a hole the size of Velrin's fist. The breach was in the engineering section, where 3 Zorathi were working to restore secondary systems. Danny reacted instantly, dropping his tools and running toward the breach while sealing his helmet. Christine shouted something at him that sounded like a warning, but he ignored her and dove into the compromised section. Through the internal cameras, Velrin watched the human engineer push 2 Zorathi crew members toward the emergency door, while the third was trapped behind fallen equipment. Danny physically lifted the debris that should have required mechanical assistance and shoved the injured Zorathi toward safety. The human sealed the emergency door from the inside, trapping himself in the venting compartment while he worked to patch the new breach. His suit was never designed for this kind of exposure, and Velrin could see frost forming on the exterior as the temperature plummeted. Jake's voice came through the comm demanding a status report, and Danny calmly explained that he was handling it while his hands moved to apply sealant patches. Lisa was calculating how long his suit would protect him, and the numbers were not good. Christine grabbed her medical kit and headed for the airlock, saying she was going in after Danny. Jake ordered her to stand down, but she ignored the order, saying that Danny would need medical attention when he finished the repair. Kevin asked if he should prepare for emergency extraction, and Jake said to stand by. The controlled chaos that seemed to define human operations reached a new level of intensity as everyone worked toward the single goal of keeping Danny alive while he saved the Zorathi ship. Danny managed to seal the breach using his entire remaining supply of patches and adhesive. His suit was covered in ice, and his biometric readings were dropping into dangerous territory, according to Christine's worried commentary. The moment the section repressurized, Christine cycled through the airlock and reached him as he collapsed against the wall. She quickly assessed his condition, finding early signs of hypothermia and hypoxia, despite his suit's best efforts. She wrapped him in thermal blankets and administered stimulants while calling for Kevin to prepare the Frontier Spirit's medical bay. Jake made the decision to evacuate Danny back to their ship for proper treatment, leaving Christine aboard the Cathara to continue working with the Zorathi crew. The human medical officer did not argue, though Velrin could see the concern in her eyes as they loaded her colleague onto a transfer stretcher. Danny gave her a weak thumbs-up gesture, which she returned before he was moved through the docking tube back to the Frontier Spirit. Velrin stood in the middle of his damaged but now stable ship, surrounded by his crew who were bruised and exhausted but alive. He looked at Christine, who was checking on the Zorathi engineer that Danny had pulled from the debris. The human medical officer was covered in sweat, and her hands were shaking slightly from fatigue, but she kept working with the same determined focus she had shown from the beginning. These humans had risked everything, including their own lives, to save a crew of strangers, and they had succeeded against impossible odds. The rescue operation was not over yet, because the Cathara still needed to be towed to a proper station for full repairs. But the immediate crisis had passed, and 17 Zorathi were breathing and warm and alive, because a human ship had answered their call. Velrin felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the galaxy and the species that inhabited it. The humans were indeed insane by any reasonable standard, but their insanity came from a place of profound compassion that transcended logic and protocol. The Galactic Council chambers were filled to capacity with representatives from 40 different species, all gathered to address what the official documents called an unauthorized rescue operation in restricted space. Velrin sat in the witness section with his crew of 16 survivors watching as the proceedings began, with formal declarations and procedural announcements that seemed designed to waste as much time as possible. Danny Webb had survived his ordeal and was recovering on the Frontier Spirit, which was currently docked at the neutral station, where the hearing was taking place. Ambassador Henry Cole stood at the human delegation table wearing formal attire that looked uncomfortable compared to the, practical jumpsuits most humans preferred. Next to him sat his aide Michelle Grant, who was reviewing data on a portable screen and occasionally whispering information into Henry's ear. The two humans looked calm and prepared, despite the serious charges being leveled against their species and the potential consequences that could include expulsion from the Galactic Council or trade sanctions or worse. The Zorathi government had sent High Delegate Cernak to present their case against the human intervention. Cernak was an older Zorathi with dark blue skin and elaborate ceremonial markings that indicated his high rank within the bureaucracy. He stood before the assembled council and began listing the violations that the Frontier Spirit had committed, starting with unauthorized entry into disputed territory and ending with reckless endangerment through improper rescue procedures. His voice was measured and formal, making each charge sound like an inevitable conclusion rather than an accusation. Cernak explained that the Zorathi government had not abandoned the Kethera crew but rather had been following proper diplomatic channels to arrange a rescue that would not violate territorial treaties. He claimed that negotiations were underway with the controlling powers, and that a solution would have been reached within another rotation cycle at most. The fact that humans had charged into the situation without waiting for diplomatic clearance had damaged years of careful relationship, building and set dangerous precedents for other species to follow. The council mediator was a tall Vraxian named Quellen whose silver skin gleamed under the chamber lights. Quellen had a reputation for strict adherence to protocol and conservative interpretation of galactic law. He called upon various technical experts who testified about the risks involved in the rescue operation and the ways that human procedures violated standard safety regulations. One expert calculated that the probability of success for the rescue had been less than 30% using accepted galactic methods, which meant the humans had gotten lucky rather than being skilled. Henry Cole listened to all of this, with an expression that Velrin was learning to read as patient disagreement. The human ambassador made notes on his datapad, but did not interrupt even when the testimony became particularly critical of human recklessness. Michelle whispered something to him at one point that made him smile slightly, but he maintained his professional composure throughout. The morning session, after a recess for mid-cycle meal, Quellen called the council back to order and invited Ambassador Cole to present the human defense. Henry stood and walked to the center of the chamber, carrying only a small data chip and his portable screen. He thanked the council for their time and acknowledged that yes, humans had violated territorial protocols by entering disputed space without proper authorization. He did not try to deny the facts of the case because the facts were clear and documented. Instead, Henry presented a simple question to the assembled representatives. He asked them to review the distress calls that the Kethera had sent over 3 rotation cycles to every government agency and organization within communication range. Michelle triggered a holographic display that showed the timeline of messages and responses. 47 distress calls had been sent, and 47 times the response had been either a denial or a referral to diplomatic channels that would take weeks to navigate. The display showed the Kethera's life support, readings declining hour by hour with projections indicating complete failure within days. Henry pointed out that the Zorathi crew had not had weeks to wait for diplomatic negotiations. They had hours at most before the oxygen ran out, and the cold killed them. He asked the council whether protocols and procedures were more important than the lives of 17 sentient beings who had done nothing wrong except have the misfortune of getting stranded in the wrong sector. Cernak objected, saying that emotional appeals should not override the legal framework that kept the galaxy functioning. He argued that allowing individual ships to make unilateral decisions about when to violate territorial boundaries would lead to chaos and the breakdown of the treaty system. Other species would follow the human example, and soon every rescue operation would become an excuse for unauthorized border crossings. The established order existed for good reasons, and those reasons did not disappear just because someone felt compassionate. Michelle Grant stood and asked permission to present evidence. Quellen granted the request, and Michelle began displaying records from galactic history, showing similar situations where crews had been abandoned due to diplomatic complications. She showed the names and faces of beings who had died waiting for proper authorization that never came. The chamber grew quiet as the list scrolled past, showing hundreds of preventable deaths over the past century alone. Henry spoke again, saying that humans understood the need for rules and structure. Earth had many nations with different laws and borders, and humans had spent thousands of years learning how to navigate those complexities. But humans had also learned that some principles were more fundamental than any rule or treaty. The principle that life had intrinsic value was one of those. The principle that responding to distress calls was not optional was another. The human ambassador explained that on Earth, there were ancient maritime traditions about ships at sea being obligated to rescue anyone in distress regardless of nationality or political affiliation. These traditions had been written into international law because humans recognized that the ocean was dangerous and unforgiving, and survival sometimes depended on strangers being willing to help each other. Space was infinitely more dangerous than any ocean, and the same principles should apply. Quellen asked whether humans expected the entire galaxy to adopt their cultural traditions as binding law. Henry responded that no, he did not expect that, but he did expect the Council to recognize that 17 beings were alive today because one human ship decided that following their conscience was more important than following protocol. He asked whether the galaxy was better off with those 17 beings alive or dead. The mediator called for a recess to allow council members to deliberate. Velrin watched as the various species gathered in small groups discussing the case in dozens of different languages. Some seemed sympathetic to the human position, while others looked concerned about the precedent it would set. The Zorathi delegation stood apart, looking displeased with how the hearing was unfolding. During the recess, Velrin was called to give testimony about the rescue. He walked to the witness platform, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes from dozens of species watching him. Quellen asked him to describe the condition of his crew before the frontier spirit arrived, and what would have happened if the humans had not responded. Velrin took a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. He testified that his crew had been hours from death when Captain Jake Morrison answered their distress call. He described the deteriorating conditions aboard the Cathera and the calculations showing they would not survive another rotation. He explained how the humans had worked with focused intensity to repair damage that Zorathi engineers thought was irreparable. He told the council about Danny Webb crawling through vacuum to seal hull breaches and Christine Hayes modifying medications on the fly to treat alien biology. Cernak interrupted to ask whether Velrin believed the rescue had been conducted safely. According to galactic standards, Velrin paused before answering honestly that no, the rescue had not been safe by any conventional definition. The humans had taken risks that would have horrified any reasonable safety inspector. Danny had nearly died from exposure, and the entire operation had balanced on the edge of catastrophic failure multiple times. But then Velrin added that his crew was alive. 16 beings plus himself were breathing and thinking and feeling, because humans did not calculate acceptable risk ratios before deciding to help. They simply helped and worried about consequences later. He told the council that it was terrifying to watch humans work, because they operated on instinct and emotion rather than careful planning. But it was also the most honorable thing he had witnessed in his 40 years of space travel. The council chamber fell completely silent as Velrin finished his testimony. He looked at Cernak and said that he understood his government's position about protocols and diplomacy. But he also understood that he would be dead if everyone followed those protocols. He asked the council to consider what kind of galaxy they wanted to live in. Did they want a galaxy where rules mattered more than lives? Or did they want a galaxy where someone would always answer a distress call? Quellen thanked Velrin for his testimony and dismissed him back to the witness section. The Zora. The announcement sent ripples through the council chambers as representatives processed what the decision meant for galactic law and precedent. Quellen stood at his podium and formally declared that the council was establishing what would henceforth be known as the Morrison Doctrine, in honor of Captain Jake Morrison and the crew of the Frontier Spirit. The doctrine stated that any species had the right to answer distress calls, regardless of territorial boundaries provided. They acted in good faith to preserve life and withdrew immediately. After the emergency was resolved, Cernak looked displeased but accepted the ruling with formal grace as his position required. The Zorathi government would have preferred to maintain strict territorial protocols, but even they could not argue against a policy that might save their own citizens in future emergencies. Several other species representatives approached Henry Cole to congratulate him on the outcome, while others looked concerned about how this new doctrine would be implemented in practice. Jake Morrison was called before the council to receive official recognition for his actions. The human captain walked into the chamber wearing a clean uniform, but still looking somewhat uncomfortable with the formal attention. He stood before Quellen and the assembled representatives while the mediator read a proclamation commending the Frontier Spirit crew for their courage and humanitarian actions. Jake accepted the recognition with a simple nod, and a statement that he and his crew had only done what anyone should do when someone needed help. Velrin watched from the witness section, as Jake looked briefly uncomfortable with being treated as a hero. The human captain seemed to genuinely believe that answering distress calls was normal behavior that did not deserve special recognition. This attitude baffled many of the council representatives who were accustomed to species that sought glory and status through their accomplishments. The humans apparently rescued people because it was right and not because they wanted medals or political advantage. After the formal ceremony concluded, Velrin made his way through the crowded corridors to the docking bay where the Frontier Spirit was preparing to depart. He wanted to speak with Jake and his crew one final time before they left to continue their exploration mission. The human ship looked small and worn, compared to the sleek diplomatic vessels docked nearby, but Velrin now understood that appearance meant nothing when it came to measuring a ship's worth. Jake was supervising the loading of supplies when Velrin arrived. The captain turned and smiled in that way humans did, showing teeth that no longer seemed threatening. Lisa Garrett was checking readiness reports on her datapad, while Kevin Price ran pre-flight diagnostics from the cockpit. Christine Hayes was restocking her medical supplies, having used most of her reserves during the rescue operation. Danny Webb was still recovering in the medical bay, but sent a message through Christine saying he would be back to full duty within a few days. Velrin approached Jake and offered the traditional Zorathi gesture of deep respect, placing both hands over his primary heart. He thanked the captain and his crew for saving his people and for changing the way the galaxy thought about rescue operations. Jake looked embarrassed by the gratitude and said again that they had just done their job. But Velrin insisted that what they had done went far beyond duty or job requirements. They had risked their lives and their ship and their standing in the galactic community to help strangers. Lisa joined the conversation and handed Velrin a small communication device. She explained that it was programmed with a direct channel to the human fleet that operated in this sector of space. If he or any other ship ever needed assistance, they could use this channel to call for help. The humans would come if they possibly could, because that was what humans did. They answered calls for help without worrying about borders or protocols or risk calculations. Amy Foster emerged from the ship carrying her own data pad filled with the diplomatic paperwork she had filed during the rescue. She showed Velrin copies of all the forms and notifications she had submitted to various governments and agencies. The amount of administrative work required to justify the rescue was staggering, but Amy had handled it all while simultaneously maintaining communications with both ships. She mentioned casually that bureaucracy was annoying but necessary, and humans had learned to work within systems even when they disagreed with those systems. Kevin leaned out of the cockpit to wave at Velrin before returning to his pre-flight checks. The young pilot had kept both vessels stable through conditions that should have sent them spinning into disaster, but he seemed to consider it just another day of work. Velrin was beginning to understand that humans had a different baseline for what constituted normal danger. They came from a world that tried to kill them constantly, so space hazards probably seemed manageable by comparison. Christine finished her inventory and came over to check on Velrin one final time. She scanned him with her medical device and pronounced him healthy, considering what he had been through. She reminded him to watch for delayed stress symptoms and to get proper rest and nutrition over the coming weeks. Her bedside manner remained gentle and professional, even though she had every right to be exhausted and irritable after the ordeal. Velrin asked how she had known which medications to use, and she admitted that much of it had been educated guessing. Combined with quick research and improvisation, the more Velrin talked with the human crew, the more he realized how much of their success had been based on instinct and adaptability rather than careful planning. They had encountered problems and solved them in real time without stopping to consult regulations or wait for expert opinions. This approach was terrifying from a safety standpoint, but undeniably effective when speed mattered more than perfection. The galaxy could learn something from human flexibility, even if most species would never be comfortable with that level of improvisation. Danny's voice came over the internal comm system, saying he wanted to talk to Velrin before the Cathara commander left. Velrin followed Christine into the medical bay where Danny was sitting up in bed looking pale but alert. The human engineer had frost damage on his hands and face from the exposure during the final hull breach repair, but he was already healing with the speed that made human biology so remarkable. He told Velrin that the Cathara was solid enough to make it to a proper repair station, but would need extensive work before returning to active mining duty. Velrin thanked Danny specifically for saving his crew members from the engineering section and nearly dying in the process. Danny shrugged, which was a human gesture indicating casual dismissal of something important. He said he had worn worse injuries and that the Zorathi engineer he pulled from the debris had reminded him of his younger brother who was also clumsy around heavy equipment. The comment was meant as humor, but revealed something about human nature that Velrin found touching. They personalized their relationships even with alien species and treated strangers as potential friends, rather than statistical lives to be saved. Jake called everyone to the airlock for final farewells. Velrin's entire crew had gathered to see the humans off and to express their gratitude. Each Zorathi came forward to offer thanks in their own way, through gestures and words that the translators did their best to convert. The humans accepted the appreciation with grace while also looking slightly uncomfortable with being celebrated. They really did seem to believe they had only done what any decent people would do. As Velrin prepared to return to the Cathara, Lisa handed him a small data chip containing the full technical specifications of the repairs Danny had performed. She explained that Zorathi engineers would need this information to properly complete the work at the repair station. The chip also contained notes on human emergency procedures and improvisation techniques that might be useful for other species to study. Lisa mentioned that humans were happy to share knowledge because everyone benefited when more people knew how to solve problems. The frontier spirit detached from the station and began maneuvering toward the jump point that would take them back to human-controlled space. Velrin stood at the observation window of his repaired quarters watching the human ship accelerate away with that characteristic aggressive piloting style. Kevin was probably at the controls, grinning as he pushed the engines harder than safety regulations recommended. The ship disappeared in a flash of light as it entered faster than light travel, leaving Velrin alone with his thoughts. Over the following weeks, news of the Morrison Doctrine spread through the galaxy, along with the story of the Cathara rescue. Some species praised the new policy while others worried about its implications, but nobody could deny that 17 Zorathi were alive, because one human captain had decided rules mattered less than lives. Trade routes began advertising human rescue capabilities as a selling point for traveling through dangerous sectors. Insurance companies started offering better rates for ships that carried human emergency contact codes. Velrin returned to active mining duty after the Cathara was fully repaired at the station. His crew worked with renewed appreciation for being alive and told the story of their rescue to anyone who would listen. Other Zorathi miners started carrying copies of the human communication channel that Lisa had provided, just in case they ever found themselves in similar trouble.